Okay, so let's carry on after our break. We're going to take a look at the startup class now and see how this environment comes together. In theory, our web service is buildable and runnable at this point. I haven't verified that here yet, but in theory it should be a working service at this point. So let's go look at our startup code. So this file already existed. We looked through it a little while ago and it had some minimal configuration stuff. What we've actually done is replaced the contents of this file. So as we look down the startup code now, you will see that we have some additional code. So we are configuring a whole bunch of Harmony Core stuff. So we are add data object mapping customer dat:/customer.ism file open mode index, blah, blah, blah. We're telling the entity framework environment about all of our entity types and what files they're in, and we're telling it where to go to find those files and so on, and mapping the physical files onto the entities that it already knows about through the EDM model. And again, I'm not going to go through all of this code in detail, but we're declaring services. We're adding the EDM builder as a service. We're adding something called the file channel manager as a service. Jeff talked about this a little bit yesterday. That's the thing that pulls file channels and deals with opening channels and reusing channels and all of that sort of stuff. So we're using one of Jeff's file channel managers. And so on. We're adding all of these various services into the environment. There's our DB context. We're creating a DB context service so that controllers can request, remember that controllers can request access to these things, as can the EF provider, through dependency injection. Adding alternate key support, adding OData support, adding MVC core and JSON formatters, and so this is just various OData and web API startup code. Here's where we're specifying HTTP redirection. We're saying we're not going to support communications to this service unless it's encrypted. Okay? If you don't want to do that, if you want to use HTTP, then you just don't do this add HTTPS redirection. Okay? This is what causes any traffic on HTTP to be redirected to this port. And here we turn on that feature. Okay? Configure services custom. We'll get into this a little bit later, but this is one of our extension points. This is something called a partial method. So basically, if you create a second half of this partial class, and if you implement a method called configure services custom, we will call it for you here. Okay? And that's declared somewhere down here. I forget exactly how that works now. But if you look through the code, you'll see it. That's, like I say, that's one of our extension points, so that you can provide custom startup code. Here we've got our configure method, and again we've just added additional code in here. Here we're saying if we're in development mode, then use the developer exceptions page. So if you get an error and you're in developer mode, and we'll see how we set that later, ASP.NET Core has an environment variable called, I think it's called ASP.NET Core _environment that you set to equals development. And that's what we're testing with this code. So if you're running in development mode, we'll show you a nice detailed error message if something goes wrong. If you're running in production mode, we won't do that, for example. Here's an example of turning on HSTS. I talked about HSTS the other day. That's the thing that guarantees clients or consumers that everything that comes out of this service is HTTPS. And if you find anything that doesn't, then go ahead and don't use our service. There are some serious implications to turning that on, by the way, so do not just do this unless you go off and read all about it and know what you're doing. Okay? I'm not going to say more than that. And more and more and more, just configuring OData, configuring web API, and so on. Here's where we're mapping our OData service route to OData, and so on. Anyway, there's our startup code. And as we go through and turn on more options, you'll see little bits of additional code appearing in here. And I will point those things out as we go through. Okay, let's see if the demo gods are going to be with us. I'm going to hit Control-Shift-B, and I'm going to build, hopefully, the project. In Visual Studio, currently the repository project is set as the default project. You can see it's slightly bold there. When I run, I want to run the host program. So I'm going to right-click and say Set as Startup Project on services.host. And now we're going to run the self-hosting program. Press F5 to run the program. And hopefully, if the demo gods are on our side, hey, our environment is up and running. It's reporting to us that its content root path, this is where it's running from. Look, services host bin debug netcore app21 www root. That's where our static files are coming from. and it's telling us it's available on these 2 ports, and it's telling us we can press Control-C to stop, and if we copy that URL, in fact I don't need to because I've got a shortcut to it here, localhost 8086, /odata, there's our service. Woohoo! If you've got something similar, congratulations. You just created your first Harmony Core OData web service, and you can use that web service. It's telling us it knows about something called customers. So if we tag on customers, not quite. We've got an OData service. It doesn't have any data right now. Okay? So what it's returned to us is essentially it started to return an array of customer, and then there's nothing there. Okay? That is what I expected at this point. Honestly, it really is. I've actually got, a slide that says we can access the OData endpoint, which we just did. We can also access the metadata. So there's the metadata that describes, and if we look in here, we should see, here's our customer entity, and here's our item entity, and so on. So all of our data is out there in the metadata now. Okay? However, build it, run it, access the endpoints, access OData customers, and oops, something went wrong. Our controller method was called, it tried to return an array of customers, but the self-hosting environment doesn't know where to find the data. Okay, so that's our next configuration step. The reason we do this, by the way, and generate it without data initially, is it's really only applicable to our sample environment. In the real world, it's your job to provide the data somewhere and set the logical names and all that kind of stuff, right? So that's why we don't enable this by default. So let's stop the hosting program. We can either go to Visual Studio and hit stop, or go to the program and hit Control-C to shut it down. Okay, and at this point, I'm just going to save my changes again. So just bear with me a second. Let's go to Windows Explorer, into our, where was I working? Workshop, Harmony Core Workshop. And let's just commit all of our changes with a super useful comment of changes. Awesome. So now everything's saved away. Okay. What we need to do is we need to generate a new self-hosting program that knows how to deal with our data. Again, this is kind of a workshop step. This is probably something that you wouldn't be doing in the real world, because right now we've got the default self-hosting program that needs to know about some other stuff. And we also need to tell it to create our test files, which is that whole environment I described earlier, where we load ISAM files every time we run, and we destroy those ISAM files whenever we shut down. So what we're going to do is we all need to go to our batch file to generate our code, and we're going to start turning on some options. Okay, the first 2 options, they're in sequence that we're going to use them. So we're going to turn on enable self-host generation, and we're going to turn on enable create test files. Okay, we're going to hit Control-S to save those changes, and then we're going to tools generate code again. I've got a shortcut key for it. Okay, so we've regenerated our code. Assuming that was successful for you, that caused 2 additional changes. It executed 1 additional code gen command, so we've now just replaced the default self-hosting program with a new one, and it also enables some other options in one of the other files, I believe. All right, so let's just look at the self-hosting program. All right, so here's the self-hosting program. Basically, what got added in this environment was we've generated this additional class in here, and this is our sample environment, essentially. So I've got a static class called self-host environment with a method called initialize. Jeff, can you remind me and tell us, what does this do? Oh, okay. Allows select to join when the keys in the file are not the same type as the keys in the code. So that thing I talked about earlier, where keys are defined, and we quite often have a decimal field, which is a key segment, but forget to drop down the thing at the end of the key definition and tell it it's a decimal field or a decimal key, causes the Synergy select class to have an issue with that. okay, because it thinks the keys don't match. So this is a workaround for that issue, so that if your repository does not correctly define fields associated with key segments as decimal key segments, this is a workaround to enable the select class to continue to do the joins there. The test environment that we talked about earlier is here. It calls a method called setLogicals, delete files, and create files, okay? And then on cleanup, we also call delete files. So this is just my sample environment. You probably would want to not generate this stuff. This is the stuff that was added because we said create test files, okay? So this is our environment only. So setLogicals, basically what it does is it knows about all the files that you're processing. So it goes through each one and extracts the logical name that's used to access the file and adds them to a collection of logical names. And then at the end, it basically uses xcall setlog to define each of those logical names to point to the sample data folder in the environment. So it will expect to find any data files that we use in that sample data folder. Clearly, in your environment, you guys need to provide code that defines the logical names here to the appropriate locations for your data files in your system environment. And that perhaps might include xfServer expressions if those files are on a remote Linux system or a VMS system, for example. So this is the kind of area where you would configure the runtime instance of all of those settings. Or this is a web app, so you could do it in a sort of app config file or something like that and read them from the config file if you prefer to do it that way. You don't have to do it at runtime like this. So in our example, this basically ensures that any logical names are present and point to the sample data folder. Then we call create files. Create files basically is just going to use open with fdl::xdl file, so it creates the ISAM file, and it's literally just reading, it's opening a sequential file that's got the data in, creating the ISAM file, reading through the sequential file, and storing the records into the ISAM file. It could be more efficient, but it's good enough for the little sample environment we've got here. And then delete files just deletes them all again, okay? One's called on startup, one's called on shutdown. So that's basically what we injected into the sample environment. Okay. And those are called from the self-host environment class, calls the initialize and cleanup methods as necessary. Okay, so now if we build and run our code, so I'm pressing F5 again, and you guys should be able to do the same thing. And now we should get the service running, which it is, and we should now be able to go to one of our endpoints. So the fact that the service is running now, the ISAM files just got created and loaded, right? So if we go and look in the, where are we working, sample data folder, you'll see we've now got ISAM files present, customer.ism and items.ism and so on. And we should be able to access our endpoint. First time always takes a little bit while everything gets loaded into memory and all of that stuff happens. And there's our response for our customer endpoints. Now we don't yet have any advanced capabilities. We don't have the filtering, selecting, order by, any of that stuff. None of that's turned on right now. We've just got an endpoint that says, give me all the customers. And we've got an endpoint that says, give me a specific customer. Okay, so there we go. We've got a basic service that's running that has an endpoint that exposes all of our entities. So if we go to items, there's all of our items, each one in a JSON array. A JSON object, an array of JSON objects, okay, and a single item. And as Jeff mentioned earlier, for basic operations like this, you don't have to use the parentheses operation. You can actually say /items/for, for example. That syntax will work as well. But when you start doing the querying, so you're doing ordering and filtering and selecting and expanding, then you have to use the parentheses syntax, which is the OData syntax. Okay, so now we have a basic service up and running. You should find that if we close down the service, you can see application shutting down, and again, I'm sitting in the sample data. Did you see all the ISAM files disappeared? So they got cleared down again. And again, the reason we're doing that is so we always have consistent data every time we run the service. So if we go and delete a bunch of stuff, we can stop the service, restart it, and it'll all come back again. All right, so we've got a basic service up and running. So we've now got the ability to go to our entity collection endpoints, customers, items, orders, order items, and vendors, and we can go to our single entity endpoints, and those things are now working. So what's next? Oh, next thing is to commit everything. So let me do that in here. Basic functions working. Okay, so we'll commit all of that, and we're good to go with the next step. All right, let's start doing some of the cooler stuff. First thing we're going to do is get ourselves some documentation so that we can refer to, get information about how to use our service. So we're going to generate our Swaggart documentation that we showed you the other day. This is going to involve plugging in some additional services to enable the documentation and the exposing of the documentation. And we're going to be using 3 external tools. Swaggart, which is an open source thing from SmartBear. Remember the guy that did the keynote speech at the conference last year? He was from SmartBear, that's the same company. They're the ones who support the Swaggart environment. Within Swaggart, there's something called Swaggart UI, which is what specifically generates HTML documentation. And we would like to be using a tool called Swashbuckle, which actually generates this documentation automatically for us based on the code that we generate. Unfortunately, it's not compatible with OData right now, but again, I mentioned the other day, it very soon will be, we hope. So right now, the approach we have to take is we have to manually use CodeGen to build the Swaggart file, and that's what we're going to do now, essentially. So what we're going to do to enable this feature is we're going to turn on one more option in our code generation batch file, enable Swaggart docs, and then we're going to regenerate code, and it will create a Swaggart file for us, which we will then add into our environment. And what we're going to do is we're going to publish it as a static file on our web server, okay? And there is tooling that will be able to consume that. So let's do that. Let's go to our regen batch file, and let's turn on enable Swaggart docs. Okay, I've done a Control-S to save, and I'm going to do a tools regenerate code. Again, I've got a shortcut key. And you can see we've now generated a file called swaggertfile.yaml. Okay, these are lovely things. Let's add it into our project so that we can see it and so that we can serve it up as a file. So we'll put it in services www-root. I'm going to right click and say add existing item, and we'll go off to the www-root folder. By default, we're looking for DBL and DBC, so we need to drop down the file type and pick our YAML file. Okay, and we're going to do one other thing. We want to serve this file up as part of the web server as static content when we publish the application. Okay, so to make that happen, what we have to do is we have to go to the properties of the file. So right click and properties, and we have to set its copy to output directory property to copy always. Okay, and what that says is when this application is published out, publish this file along with it. It's not a binary file, it's not a DLL or an exe, so by default it would not get published. But now we're saying copy this out. When this app is deployed, include this file in the www-root folder. Okay, so with that change, we should be able to... So let's take a look at the file first of all. So a Swaggart file can be in one of two formats. It can be a JSON format, or it can be in a format called YAML. A YAML file basically describes the API. So it's saying we're using the Swaggart 2.0 API. Here we've got some, by the way, be very careful in here. Indentation is critical in this file. JSON has open brace and closed brace. XML has its open tag, closed tag. The reason YAML is so concise is there's no opening and closing tags. Okay, there are opening tags, but there's no closing tags, and the indentation, the number of spaces, is absolutely critical. You miss a space and the whole thing falls apart. Okay, so be careful. You can always regenerate it if you mess it up. But you can see we've got an information section with general information. We're declaring the host where we're hosting the service, the base path. We're declaring that we're only supporting HTTPS. We're declaring that we're only supporting JSON in this environment. we have some tags. What do the tags do? Oh, the tags allow you to group operations together. So you can declare a tag called customer, and then you can declare this operation belongs to customer, so it groups them all together. That's optional. And then we declare paths. So we're saying we have an endpoint which is customers. At that endpoint, we support doing a get, and there's a summary and a description and an ID for the operation. We're saying this is part of the customers group. It generates a 200 response, which is an OK. Then the schema for the response is an array of definitions customer. And below, there's a definition of what customer means. So we're simply declaring all the endpoints, what parameters come in, what gets returned. Here's another one. There's an endpoint at /customers, customer number equals number. It is a get, description, it's part of customers. There is a parameter. It's called a customer number. It comes from the path, the URL. It has a description. It's required and it's an integer. Possible responses are 200 OK and a customer record, or 404 not found. So it literally describes everything the API does. Okay, there's our Swagger file. Okay. What we should be able to do is, let's look at what changed in the startup file. So if we go to Team Explorer, we should be able to see that the startup file changed. And we just added a couple of new imports. We're importing Swashbuckle ASP.NET Core Swagger and Microsoft ASP.NET Core static files. We've got a little bit of new code that is adding a service called SwaggerGen and adding another service called Add API Explorer. That's the Swagger UI stuff. And then we've got a bunch of new code in the startup class, which is configuring the environment for static files. Essentially, .yaml is not a supported file type as far as the web server is concerned out of the box. So what this is doing is adding a media type for text/YAML and saying it's okay to serve out those extensions, and then turning on the serving of static files again. And this is some configuration for the Swagger UI. So we're telling it that the Swagger file with the data is at the root directory and it's called that, and we're serving up the docs at a URI of /API docs. So we're configuring where the documentation is published. And then we're turning on the service with app.use Swagger UI and specifying the configuration. So that's what got added as a result of adding this enable Swagger docs. Okay? So we should, this is just looking at the same information with a view on the slides. We should, in theory, be able to start our self-hosting program. So I'm pressing F5 to build and run. And it should tell us API documentation is available at https localhost 8086 API docs. So if we copy that and go to that URL, there's our Swagger documentation. Okay? And by default, these are those tag groupings. So we got our 5 groupings for our 5 entity types. We've got also the definition of our model. Oh, I didn't show you this in the Swagger file, but at the bottom it just describes customer has this property, it's an int, it's called this, it's sample data and all that kind of stuff. So it's showing us what the data looks like. Customer number is an integer, example values, name, street, city, and so on. And then as you can see, we've got our 2, for each one of our things, we've got our 2 operations exposed. Collection of customers and get a single customer. And again, remember, you can actually use this thing to test stuff if you wish. So basically here it's saying one possibility is it returns 200 OK, and another possibility, and this example data, another possibility is it returns 404 not found. Okay? If we want to try it, we can say try it out. We can enter a customer number, let's do number 3, and say execute. And there's the response. So the actual response was 200, and there's the data. And by the way, there's the HTTP headers that came back as well if you're interested in looking at that sort of stuff. Yeah. Okay, if it says it can't find the Swagger file, probably it didn't get published, so probably you weren't successful in setting it to copy always, which basically looks like in Solution Explorer. When we added it to the www root project, we went into right-click properties and set copy to output directory to copy always. And then if you build and run again, it should get published out. Where did it get the sample data from? In the project template for the workshop template, it's included in there. So there's a sample data folder in the solution, and it has unloaded sequential data, and it has an XDL file, and the code loads that data into an ISAM file. Oh, okay, where did the Swaggart API get the sample data from? Okay, CodeGen has a token called sample data, and by default it generates ABC for an alpha and 1, 2, 3 for a decimal and so on. In this environment, the sample data is a little bit more extensive. So in this case, what we have done is in our repository, if you look behind any of the fields, name, for example, we have added in the long description a special little code that says sample data equals Abe's Bakery. And CodeGen, if you use the sample data token, picks up on that if it's there, and if not, uses ABC or 1, 2, 3. Okay? Okay, so now we've got documentation. What's next? Let's get some exciting stuff done. Where are we? Okay, so we got our documentation. We can test from the documentation. Okay, I'm just going to go and commit everything again so that we can see differences. Docs done. Okay, what's next? Next, what we're going to do is show you how you can use the Postman tool to interact with your RESTful services if you wish to do so. So this is another quick, just generate a quick file. We'll be moving past this one pretty quickly. So Postman is a free utility that you can download that lets you construct HTTP requests, be they gets, posts, puts, patches, whatever. And it's a commonly used tool. So the steps here are going to be very, very similar to what we did before. In fact, let's just go ahead and do it. So we're going to edit our regen batch file one more time. And we're going to turn on the next option, which is enable Postman tests. Okay, I'm going to do a Control S to save, and I'm going to regenerate code. This is not generating a file that we need to include in our project. It's simply a file that we can include into Postman to import the tests. The contents of the Postman file will expand. Every time we add more features, we're going to be putting more test cases into the Postman file. So basically, every time we move on to a new step, we're going to have to re-import that file into Postman. But you'll see it created a file called postmantests.postmancollection.json. I'm not going to bother looking at it because it's not particularly interesting, to be honest. It just defines a whole bunch of Postman tests. So I'm just going to start Postman. Okay, so I'm going to, this is ultimately what we're going to wind up with. I'm going to delete mine. So once you're in Postman, what I'd recommend is you do two things. First of all, the first time you come in here, I would suggest you go to File, Settings, and there is an option that says Ssl Certificate Validation. So by default, Postman will not talk to services that use self-signed certificates. So you need to turn off Ssl Certificate Validation, okay? Because we are using a self-signed. Now ignore these other folders, these are just various other things of mine. What I'm going to do is hit the big import button up here, and I'm going to hit the Choose Files button, and I'm going to go off to our Harmony Core sample folder. So mine is in Workshop, Harmony Core Workshop, and in that directory you should find that Postman tests, postmancollection.json. If you click on that file, it should bring in, and if you can't see this area, click on Collections. I think it might default to History. So if you're in the Collections area, you should now see a collection of Harmony Core Sample API, and it should say 32 requests. Okay? If you click on that, it'll expand them. They're categorized by type, so you've got customer tests, item tests, order tests, and so on. Don't worry about the get access token. That's right at the end. We're going to use that when we talk to our OAuth server. Let's just look at customer tests, for example. I got the template wrong for this one. It should just have the two reads in there, but we've already got our post, put, patch, and delete in there. I'll reorganize that at some point. They won't work right now. We don't have those endpoints described. So for each of these, we can only do the read customers or read customer. What you need to know when you're using Postman is the tests I generate don't have appropriate key values inserted. So if you do read customers, for example, that one should work. Okay. Oh, hang on, this is me. No environment, is that right? Oh, sorry, our service isn't running. Okay, we need to run the service. So back to Visual Studio and F5. So our service is now running. We should be able to hit send. First request always takes a while it gets things up and running in the background, and there's our result data. So you can see the primary things to know about Postman are we're doing a GET request, instead of a post or a put or a patch or a delete or a copy or a head or whatever. So we're doing a GET to this URL. We can interact with things like request headers. So here we've got a collection of headers. We're saying accept application JSON. That's an HTTP header that says, I would like you to return JSON data, please. Some services can return XML as well, so you can request it by passing that appropriate header. And here's the response. We can see the response headers that came back from the server. We can see the response body that came back from the server. If it's a recognized format, it will format it for you, or you can, it doesn't return all of this white space. This is just Postman making it look pretty. If you select raw, that's what the data actually looks like. Okay? But Postman can make it nice and pretty for us. Okay? If you do read customer, you'll notice that when I generate the file, I insert OData customers, insert customer number. So I'm not generating test values into the Postman files. Yeah, I'm trying to figure out a way of doing that. So you need to, if you're dealing with a specific endpoint, you need to come in here and say, I want customer 5, for example. So just double click it and put whatever customer number you want, and then do send, and there's customer number 5. Okay? So Postman doesn't really give us anything over and above the browser for doing GET requests, okay, other than it's a nice environment to work in. But we'll absolutely have to use it when we want to test our post and put and delete and stuff like that. Or you might just choose to do all of your testing in here. Some people do. I tend to use Postman over and above a browser because it just gives me more options, and I can look at the header values and things like that. So that's what Postman does. I'm probably going to use the browser primarily until we get to the post, put, delete stage, where then I'll have to drop back to Postman again. Okay, so we've done that. We've tested our API with Postman, and I'm just going to, once again, save things away so that I can show us differences later. So Postman, and let's commit those changes. Okay. All right, what's next? Now we're going to start getting into making our service do some additional stuff. So we're going to add support for alternate keys. So currently we're exposing 2 endpoints per entity. We're exposing getAll and getSingle by primary key. Okay? All of the sample ISAM files have several other keys. For example, customers have a key on state, zip code, payment terms, and favorite item. Item has vendor number, color, size, name, and so on. So what we're going to do is expose an OData endpoint to expose data by all of these alternate keys. Okay? So what we're going to be doing in this case is generating additional methods into our controllers, essentially. We've got all the infrastructure in place. Our EF provider is already there. It's been dependency injected in there. We're just going to add extra operations and extra URLs to the service, and we're going to call different methods to drill in by state code or by payment terms or by zip code or whatever it happens to be. So all of those keys that exist. So guess what? We're going to go to our regen batch file, and we're going to turn on that option. Now, in the real world, the reason I'm stepping through this, and I know it's kind of tedious, but I'm trying to have you understand at each stage what's happening. When we want alternate key support, what actually happens? What new code do we get? In the real world, once you understand what these things do, you can just come in here and say, yes, I want that, I don't want that, I want this, uncomment them all, generate the code, build it, and you're done. Okay? So we could finish this workshop by just removing all of these REM statements, generating the code, and we're done at that point. Okay? It really is that simple. So in the real world, if your repository were in good shape, you'd be done already. So bear with me. I'm trying to help you understand what each of these individual things does. So I'm going to turn on enable alternate key support. I'm going to Control S to save. I'm going to generate code. Nothing new got generated. We've still got the exact same files being generated. Okay, but what changed on this occasion was we added a bunch of new stuff into our controllers. Okay, so let's go and look at one of the controllers. We'll pick customer for no other reason than it's first in the list. You can see that we've got a little red check mark, so all of our controllers have changed. If we go to our Team Explorer, we'll see that our controllers have changed. Our Swagger file has changed, so it's now got more endpoints exposed in the documentation. Our Postman file has changed, so we've got more tests exposed through Postman, and our generate file has changed. Let's look at the changes in customer, and essentially it's just a big block of new methods at the bottom, right? So rather than look at it this way, let's look at it this way. So here's our get all customers that we had originally. Here's our get single customer by primary key that we had originally. And then below, we've got 5 additional methods. So it's just another method. OData route is customers state equals. And as I mentioned earlier, when it comes to alternate keys, you have to name the key segment, provide the value. Name the key segment, provide the value in the URL. So state equals value. Again, a state matches a state, the parameter, which is defined as coming from the URL here. So everything relates together. And all we're doing here is the EF provider has an extension method called findAlternate, which guess what? Searches for matching entities by alternate key, and it figures out which alternate key by looking at the combination of parameters that you provide. So in this case, we're providing 1 and its state, so it'll figure out which key to go use to access the file. So that returns a collection of all customers that match that state. If it comes back null, there was nothing, so we return not found. Not found is simply a helper method that returns an HTTP 404 status. Okay, 404 not found. If we don't get null, then we return an HTTP 200, and within the body, we include result, which is the collection of customers. That's how the EF provider works. Okay, simple. Simple source. Same for zip code, exactly the same thing. Same for by payment terms code. Again, notice they all start with the word get. So that's that convention that says we're doing an HTTP get to the base URL followed by customers paren payment terms code equals will be routed to this method. Okay? Real simple. RESTful web services are so simple to build once you understand the basic concepts. You know, if you were adding these custom functions, you're just adding a little bit of code like this and give it a route, make sure the parameters match the parameters and so on, and then write the code to do whatever it needs to do. Real simple stuff. Okay, so we've got our additional endpoints. We should, in theory, we'll review this in a moment, but we should have some additional operations defined in our documentation at this point, and we should have some additional test points in our Postman environment. I'll do that before I forget. Let's go and do that first. So we have alternate key endpoints. How are we doing for time? 11:33, good. And let's go and test it and see what happens. Oh, it's already running, so let's stop it and start it again. And if we, I guess we'll go into, let's drill into it through the documentation. Oh, we're already there, so we should be able to just refresh this. And now you can see we've got our additional endpoints. So if we were to drill into state, for example, try it out, let's do Washington, execute. First one always takes a few seconds, and there's our customers in Washington. And hopefully, yeah, Washington, Washington, and so on. They all are. In theory, we could take, there's the request URL that was made. Like I say, if we don't want to use the Swaggart docs, it's just a GET request, so of course we can do it in the browser if we wish. And just to prove the point, let's go back to Postman. I'm going to re-import, pick the file, tell it to overwrite. Now we've got 48 requests, and we've got our things like, let's do get customer by payment terms. Again, I have to give it the payment terms, let's say 30 days, send. Oh, no, I guess this one's a different one. Is it 1? No, I forget what the data is now. Read customers, so let's read all. Payment terms code 01. Okay, so by payment terms code 0. Oh, it's an alpha. Okay, 01. There's the matching data. So whether we test through Postman, through the web browser, through the documentation API, doesn't really matter. Okay, so now we've got endpoints that let us drill into our data efficiently by alternate key. Awesome. We've already done the save, so let's move on. This one's a real quick one. Another little capability of OData is to just return the count of something. You know, if you just need to know how many orders does this company have, or how many products are there in this product group, then there's an efficient way of doing that. And if you enable the functionality, then you're able to just append $count to the end of the URL, okay, for a collection, obviously. We do have a slight issue in this area that right now, for some reason, it's only working with our primary key endpoints. Not quite sure why. I'm pretty sure it used to work with like customers in state Washington $count, and it used to work, and right now it's not. So that's on our list of things to look at. The way we enable this is just to turn on one of our code generation options, enable count. And so all this is actually doing is in our startup class, it's simply turning on another OData option. We're saying builder.count, and that just says enable count support on the collection endpoints. And we are generating additional endpoints into our documentation, and we're generating additional endpoints into our Postman files so that you can test them. So let's just very quickly do that. We'll go off to our regen file and we'll say, yes, we would like count endpoints, please. I'm going to save. I'm going to generate code. We will see that our startup class changed, as did our Swagger file and so on. And the change in our startup file is we just added builder.count to say, turn on count support, please. That's it. We've now got count support. Okay. I'm not going to go through and bother testing that. I'm sure you'll, well, if you don't trust me, try it yourself. But we can say customers slash dollar, question mark dollar count, slash dollar count on the end of the URL, and it will simply return the matching number. Okay, so let's enable count and commit all. Okay, so let's just stop that because we're going to be adding some new stuff in a moment, and let's go back to our slides, and we've done that. Another capability of OData is, this is particularly useful if you're building mobile apps and stuff like that, where you might want to target very specific pieces of single information. You know, I know a customer code, I just want to know the name of the account or the account balance or how many orders they've got or do they have any orders outstanding, individual snippets of information. So OData lets you do that by having individual property endpoints, so that you can access, for example, any single entity and then slash and then the name of any single property within that entity, and you will just get back that specific piece of information. It's not just that piece of information, you do get a little bit of metadata wrapped around it, so you get the OData.context attribute still, but you can see there's a fairly small amount of data being returned from this query. There is also the capability to say individual property slash $value, and in that case, you only get the raw value. So if I ask for the customer name and it's San Paulo's nursery, if I say $value, I don't get the brace and the OData context and the value colon, I literally just get the raw data. So that's very, very efficient. Another apology, it's broken at the moment. I'm afraid, again, it used to work and something happened and we're not quite sure what at this point. So the $value is not going to work right now, but watch this space, we'll get that sorted as soon as we can. So again, this is another very, very quick one. We're going to enable our individual endpoints by turning on that particular option. So we'll do that. We'll generate the code. And we will, let's build it and run it. So F5. Oh, let me show you what changed. What changed is just a bunch of, you'll notice all of our controllers have changed, as we might have expected. And again, we've just added a whole block of new stuff to the end of all of the controllers. So let's go back and look at that this way. And what we will find is, here's the end of our alternate key endpoints. And now we've got an endpoint for every property. So customers value slash name. We don't have one for customer number, because that's the primary key and you have to have the customer number, so there's no point accessing that one as a named property. But for all of the non-primary key, so here's /name, /street, /city, and so on. You'll notice we're not doing anything different with the EF provider. We're still just going off through the EF provider and saying, give me the customer data in its entirety, but we're returning not result, which is the whole result, but result.name, which is just the name property. And again, we're returning a 404 not found if we don't get a match, or returning a 200 OK if we get a match. So this stuff is real simple. And a whole bunch of properties, obviously potentially hundreds of them if you've got big structures in your environment. And again, I'm not going to run it up at this point. Well, let's do it, I guess. Let's run up the server and let's go off through, we'll just do it in a browser. Let's go, we've got, here we've got customers in Washington. Let's just go for customer 8 and say we would like /name. There's the response to the name endpoint. And again, I'm pretty sure, let's give it a try, but I'm pretty sure it's broken right now. Yeah, that should have just come back literally with the raw data of the name. We'll drill into what's going on there. Okay, so that's individual property endpoints. So we've reviewed the changes to the controller, the additional options. Again, the API documentation has endpoints for all of these things, as does the Postman data, so whichever way you choose to test is fine. Okay, so let's stop that, we already did, and property endpoints. All right, this is the exciting stuff. This is where all the real power comes in, enabling advanced query tools. So as we mentioned earlier in the week, the way we've implemented it in the environment is we've allowed you to pick and choose which ones of these you do or don't want. So we don't turn them all on together. You can pick and choose and say, primarily right now so that you can choose not to have skip, if you know that's the inefficient one right now. So selecting allows you to specify or to constrain the individual properties that come back for every entity. So it's like a, select column from in a SQL statement. Filter allows you to apply filter expressions to constrain the records that come back from any given query. And obviously these can be used against endpoints. Well, some of these, filter you would only use against a collection endpoint. Select you might use against any endpoint. Order by, again, you would use against a collection endpoint to say you want to order by one or more individual properties. And optionally, you can use the space DESC keyword. Top equals 10, return only the first 10 matching, or skip a number of rows before returning data. And they can all, subject to all of them apart from select, only returning on a collection, or only being appropriate on a collection. You can combine these things in any combination that you wish to achieve the results. It is a little bit strange seeing things like $filter, state, space, EQ, space, quotes, California, quotes in a URL. It's kind of weird because you don't have spaces in URLs. So what you will find is as you build these queries up, as you paste them into a browser, the spaces are going to get replaced with %20 and things like that. So you'll paste it in and the URL will change. But it all works just fine. But spaces are going to get converted, URL encoded, quotes are going to get URL encoded, and so on. So you just need to bear that in mind. So in our batch file, we've got basically 5 operations that allow us to individually enable and disable these particular features. So let's go ahead and do that in regen. So now we're going to turn on all of them. Let's turn on, and if you hold down Alt as you drag, you can select multiple rows. So let's turn on all 5 of those, okay, and save and generate our code. And again, no new files being generated at this point, we're just changing the content. Startup file in this case, again, we're simply turning on various options, builder.select, builder.orderby, builder.filter, and so on, to enable those pieces of functionality. Anyway, so we should now have that support. If we build, by the way, we've also changed the Swaggart file and the Postman file. Actually, the Postman file didn't change that much in relation to this one, but the Swagger file did. And the result of that is that when you run and host the service, if we go off to our documentation, the effect of enabling query doesn't add any new endpoints, but what it adds in the documentation is, if we look at get customers, for example, you'll see that we've got select, filter, order by top, and skip here in the possible inputs. And it's telling us these are query parameters, so they belong in the URL, okay? So if we say try it out, we get to enter these expressions, okay? So we could, for example, say $select equals name, comma, credit, limit. And if we execute that query, now we're still getting our E tag, which is our GRFA representation if we want to do optimistic concurrency updates. And you can see the only properties we're getting back are the two properties we requested. If we want to combine these queries, so here we've got what, credit limit 14, 5,000, 8,000. So we could perhaps say, let's do a filter, and let's say credit limit greater than or equal, so space GE greater than or equal to 6,000. And if we execute that, if the demo gods are on our side, 8,000, 7,000, 8,000, so you can see the filter has been in effect. The select is in effect. I guess we could try, they're still in primary key sequence right now, so I guess we could do a order by credit limit descending. Don't have to do descending, obviously. So we'll combine a select, a order by, and a filter. So now we've got the highest credit limit first, next lowest, and so on. So now you can really start to see the real power of this stuff, because all we're doing is exposing a collection of all customers, and now we're able to drill into it and query it pretty much in any way we want. And you can build up some real complex expressions and multiple filters and things like that. It's very, very powerful. Okay, let's play with, just so that you can see that it does actually work, let's say we'll have the top two only, please. So hopefully we should just get two responses now. Notice we've got 10,000 and 9,500. So this is the inefficient part. If we say let's skip the first two and get the next two, 9,000, 8,000. So it does work, but the further you get down the file, it's reading the whole file all the way to get to the point where it needs to start. And like I say, Roger's guys have a design for manipulating GRFAs and things to address that in the future. Or some, I'm not exactly sure what they're going to do, to be honest. But they have a design in mind for making that more efficient. Okay, it's 11:58. Let's have lunch.